All right, well, good afternoon, and welcome to our concurrent session. And the title of the session is Raising Inclusive Children, a Guide for Parents. And my name is Ted Hamory, and I'm the head of school at the Oaks School in Los Angeles. And I'm co-presenting today with Tanynya Hekymara, who works at the school as well. She's the director of Admissions and Civic Engagement. And typically what we do at our school is it's a collaborative model. So we're going to co-present this topic for a number of reasons. And I think we want to also model sort of one of the goals is to model sort of cross-racial collaboration and cross-racial understanding. And just to be aware, and we'll talk a little bit more about it in the presentation, is that we all have blind spots and we all have biases, internal biases. And so working with people who bring different perspectives to things and in your presentations allows for the presentation to be much stronger. And so that's kind of the thinking behind what we're doing here today. So we'll take turns and we'll both be answering questions, and each of us will have a chunk of the presentation to go through with you. But the idea of today is to really actionable things that you can do as parents. And we're going to kind of play off some of the topics also that Dr. Grant just presented in the main session. So you'll see some of the content will be similar, but we'll kind of go in some different directions with it as well. And we also built in 3 different breaks through the presentation for questions. So we'll just kind of ask you can enter them in the Q&A box, but we'll ask you to, hold them for that period, and then Johanna will read those out, and we'll pause at those 3 times. So let's dive in. The first thing, let's kind of look at our agenda. We'll introduce ourselves a little more deeply in a moment. We'll go through some goals. We'll dive into some foundational knowledge that we think you should have to raise children who are anti-racist and anti-biased. So we're going to really talk a lot about you as a parent or you as an adult in a child's life, and how you can sort of work on yourself so that you can work on the children around you. We're going to look at the 4 goals of anti-bias education, which are identity, diversity, justice, and action. We're going to spend a chunk of time on each of those through the lens of parents. Like, what can you do as a parent to make sure that this approach is successful with your child? At the end, we'll share some resources, and there'll be plenty, as I mentioned, plenty of time for questions and answers. But first, some introductions. And so Tanynya is going to go first and introduce herself.
Good afternoon. I'm very pleased to be here. Introductions are a powerful way in order for the speaker to help the folks that are listening and that we're learning together to understand our whys. And so that's what we're going to do here just for a few moments. So I want to start by saying that I am a descendant of the architects of this country. I am a survivor of the chains of oppression. I exist because of a history of ancestral resistance and resilience. I am the daughter of activists, educators, and first-generationers. I stand on the shoulders of Malcolm, Angela, Martin, Tony, James, Belle, Audrey, and more. I am the parent of our future. I am an educator for transformation. So I am an educator because I was first born into it. And I made a journey all the way through working at a university, and then at a high school, and then at an access organization, and I landed at the Oaks School. And so why do I do justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion work? The main reason is because I'm a Black woman in America. And the history of the oppression and violence that is directly attributed to my family includes, my grandmother on my dad's side being run out of Texas, and my grandmother on my mom's side not being able to go to school because she was Native American after the age of 13. My parents being the first to get a higher education passed that on. So my history is of affirmation, resistance, and resilience. My dad was a Black Studies professor and really talked about and pushed for getting the history told the way it should be told and taught. And then my mom, I would say, was the access and sociologist of the family. So I have this combination of both. And so I was born into it. And I continue doing this work, and I continue doing this work at the Oaks because the Oaks walks the walk. We're putting in the work. I get to show up as who I am without hiding aspects of myself. And we're forever growing. I'm always learning, and I have lots of co-conspirators, allies, and accomplices. That's why I do this work.
And a different story for me. So I came into education, what I always say is in sort of an unexpected way. I wasn't, when I left college, finished college, I wasn't planning to be a teacher, and I sort of fell into the profession that almost instantly loved. I graduated from college and joined an organization that places recent college graduates in urban or rural settings that have a teacher shortage. And I thought, well, wouldn't that be a great thing to do on the way to something else? And, being a very privileged white male, I was placed in an environment that really challenged all my beliefs of how I'd been raised, how I'd experienced life up until that point, and really opened my eyes through education. And I fell in love with being of service and helping move people forward in their life. I speak Spanish, so I was placed as a bilingual teacher. And so for the first maybe 20 years of my career, I taught in bilingual dual language immersion and other bilingual programs, and really learned a lot through that journey about equity, and particularly working in very marginalized and underserved communities, and really seeing what the educational system was like firsthand. And I realized honestly that I was there. If I was going to be there, I had to be there to be of service, and I had to be there to work for equity, to work for justice, and to make sure that everybody's experience was fair and everyone was included. And that's become my passion. So somebody who came from privilege, and again, using that privilege to help move the whole world forward. And so that's why I'm invested in anti-bias education, is from that sort of genesis moment of working in schools that really had nothing and no hope and no future, and really thinking that our schools and our education system is the way to move forward in this world. So it's become a lifelong kind of passion of mine to do anti-bias education and to do diversity and inclusion work. That's a little bit, we'll dive a little bit more into that later, but both of us have many years of experience in this field, and so we're happy to share that with you today and kind of talk through, as I said, as parents, what you can do at home. And so moving forward, the goals we're going to look at today. So as I said, we're going to look at some foundational understandings of racism, institutional racism, and systems of oppression. Kind of play off of what Donald was talking about, and really focus on some tools and then some self-work that you can do as a parent on privilege, bias, and ingrained racism. Again, we'll develop an understanding of identity, diversity, justice, and action. And most importantly, I think, is build on the momentum of this moment and leave feeling energized to continue this work. And if these topics are new to you, it's a chance for you to be energized and to sort of get some tangible things that you can do to be part of the solution. So we want to talk about the current context for where we are right now. And so as I mentioned before, so anti-bias education and anti-racist activities are not new, right? They've come to the forefront at the moment, right? So groups like Black Lives Matter and other community organizers and community activists have been working on these things for a very long time. There's a whole wealth of scholarly journal writing and articles and books and topics. For better or worse, this moment we are it's a lot of people who are new to this are coming to it. And so the police brutality and the murders of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, protests, the current political discourse around racism, and there's this increased so like, for example, anti-racist books are some of the top sellers at the moment on Amazon. And so there's a desire for more tangible information and steps for parents to take. So that's kind of the current context that we're in. And then moving forward. And this is, you may have heard this before, but this is one way to sort of conceptualize systemic racism and why it's important as parents to engage with your children or the children in your lives around this. And to think about a system of racism as a moving walkway, right? So imagine you're at the airport, you get on there, and you just sort of, it takes you to the destination. And so in this case, the destination is continued systemic racism, continued systems of oppression, right? So if you don't do anything, you just wind up there, right? So if you're not actively moving, but you could even be on that walkway and say, well, I don't agree with systemic racism. I don't agree with, I want to dismantle these things. But if you're not actually turning around and walking in the action, you're still going to wind up reinforcing those systems. And so that's kind of a visualization that you can use, is that you have to actually stop and get off this moving walkway. And we'll talk about that, ways you can do that. But thinking about that as a parent. So just doing the same things your parents did or the same things that your friends are doing. You have to look with a critical eye at those things, and you have to sort of move to action. So you'll do some learning, but you could be standing on that walkway, reading all the books about anti-racism, reading articles, posting on social media. But if you're not actually doing the work and turning around and applying the work, you're going to wind up in the same place, reinforcing systemic racism. Tanynya, I'll let you talk about this one.
So this is a visual that really resonated with me, and so we added it in here, and it is from Ibram Kendi and adapted by Black Lives Matter. And I really like the way that it flows through the different, the spectrum of where we can be in our growth in terms of learning about anti-racism and getting to the growth zone. I think what's really impactful about this is that it takes a while to get to the growth zone. And then the growth zone lasts forever because there's always so much to learn about the recontextualizing of racism and any of the isms. And so the growth zone is permanent, right? It's a moving permanence. So becoming an anti-racism, if you notice that in the fear zone, there's still some denial of the systems of racism and the systems of oppression. There's a lot of uncomfortableness that happens during the fear zone. And so moving through the fear zone to the learning zone, and we'll talk in more detail about how to move through these different iterations. So I'm just gonna really highlight just some of the key parts of it. The learning zone is very personal, right? And that's the time when you're gonna be curious, or we are gonna be curious about a group of people that we may not know much about. And that is personal, and I say that because we know that we need to learn that on our own and not necessarily ask the group or a person that is a member of that group to give us the answers. And then the growth zone is more the action. And so you're no longer allowing microaggressions to happen in your presence. You're speaking up about it. You're noticing and asking for change and moving change forward. So moving to the next slide, there is, this is a slide that we use a lot. It is the multicultural process of change. And it's really important to, again, look at the growth and the changes. And so I'm going to start by saying that this process could be in a circle because it's continual. When you learn one new thing, it means that then you move on to the next level of learning. And so this idea of monoculturalism is that research has proven that we tend to learn to live in communities where people look like us and think like us. And what this does is it confirms who we are. And so that can be both positive and it can be detrimental to our growth as people who are members of, an America that doesn't just look like us. And so the monoculturalism is where we learn, right? It's our family. We tend to choose our friends in a monocultural type of way. And so this can be more than just race related. It can be attached to religion. It can be attached to fraternities, colleges. Monoculturalism really is where we feel comfortable because people are like us. And so that, if you can remember back to the circle of becoming an anti-racist, this is where that fear zone is developed, because if you have never experienced other cultures, then there may be some misunderstandings about that culture. And then moving through it is much like the becoming an anti-racist, right? And so there's the personal part of it, right, which lies with us. And then there's the interpersonal, which as parents, that interpersonal can start with our family and then moves outward towards our extended family and towards our communities. And so the interpersonal lives there. And then institutional is all of the places in which we spend time. And that can be church, it can be school, it's the government, it is where we choose to have our healthcare, our doctor's offices, you name it. Any institution in which we are part of is institutional. And so the aim of institutional is systems. And so moving towards breaking down systems of oppression is where the institutional happens. Cultural is always the last thing to change because it has to do with people. And so we can change the systems, but it doesn't necessarily change the culture. And so knowing that power often lies not in the titles of the people in the institution, but in the way in which the people behave and the beliefs, the cultural part of an institution can be the last thing to change and can oftentimes be the most difficult. Ted, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, and I think you could look at this moment where we are right now in our country, and you could see all of these four boxes at play right now, and the previous slide too. What you're seeing, maybe I'll back up to that slide. What you're seeing, I think, in this country right now is resistance to moving from monoculturalism on an institutional, this countrywide level, right? Moving from monoculturalism to equity and inclusion. And I like this slide a lot because for me, it really it puts words around what's happening in our country. And it's been happening, you could point back numerous instances over the past, let's say 10 years of this tension happening, right, in our country right now, where people are being included and voices are being raised up, and you can see resistance to that. So the resistance to the movements and the protests are really coming from this monocultural lens, this melting pot assimilation exclusion lens. So I think that's I like this is a good talking point for friends and family, just to sort of conceptualize that. But moving forward, I think, again, thinking about yourself as a parent, we're asking, or advising you to to start to think about yourself and where do you fall at the moment, right? And know that you're going to become an anti-racist and an anti-biased human, right? You have to go through change. You have to undo things that you've absorbed, right? As learners, we're learning all the time whether those lessons are being explicitly taught to us or not. So we're picking up signals and messages all the time. And so again, to shift out of that and to sort of critically examine who we are and what our beliefs are and why really requires some thought. And so the first aspect here is the cognitive. So it's doing things like this, coming to an anti-racist, anti-bias seminar and learning. It's reading articles. It's talking to people about how do I do these things. So really the thinking piece. Once you've sort of got that understanding, you move to the behavioral aspect. So here are the things I'm going to do differently. And we're going to give you a few of those today. And then the last piece, I think it's kind of how Donald started his presentation today, was the impact of both of those things. You're going to have to stop doing things. And that could even be stop seeing certain people or stop having people in your life who act and believe a certain way. And it's just attending to all three of those as you sort of move through this, knowing that the thinking and studying piece is probably the easiest. But once you move to action, that there's going to be some emotional fallout from that. Simple example of that is, if I'm trying to lose weight and I really like ice cream, I can study and I can learn that, maybe not eating ice cream before I go to bed is a good thing. So I don't buy it and I don't put it in the freezer anymore, right? But when I'm standing there at 9:30 at night, hungry for ice cream, I don't feel really good, right? And so just understanding that this cycle is something that we all go through. And then oppression. And Tanynya, I think this is you. I think you're muted, Tanynya.
I am, sorry. Is the historical, over time, ongoing systematic targeting of certain groups as less than. And so when we refer to racism, we are talking about it at a systematic level, less about a personal acts of racism. And so that's really where we're landing today. And part of that is the family structure, which is why we're gonna take that back to parents. And so we're gonna move forward in terms of talking about what is a historically excluded group and what is a historically included group. And so it's important to know these. Can we go to the next slide?
Yeah.
So if you take a look at this slide, it really illustrates this is not all of our core cultural identifiers, but it is some of them. And oftentimes when we are doing different presentations and we're leading workshops, we have people just sit with this for a moment and mark where they fall in it. And it's a bit illuminating. And I'll just say that for me, I remember the first time that I looked at this and I thought, oh no, I'm my age, really? And so some of them are movable and others of them are not. And I just want to say that not all of these are the same, right? And so when we talk about it, we're going to talk about intersectionality later. But it's important to first know where you are and where your family is and where the family influences fall on this chart, because it will help you as you move forward as a parent to be able to bring in experts and books to fill in those areas in which you do not hold the group membership in.
And yeah, and I think it's a really good activity to kind of look at yourself and see where do you have privilege and where don't you have privilege, and where does privilege evolve over time, and what is fixed, right? So and race is at the top for a reason, because it's fixed, right? So you can have privilege in lots of other areas and still be a historically excluded group by race. And I think, you know, that just looking at the nuances of that is really good. And seeing that there's lots of different ways to sort of walk through with bias and privilege and blind spots, right? And so thinking about this historically included group, it's just sort of understanding that too. And it sort of brings into focus, I think, what we're trying to do here. So this is, if you think about the historically included group, that's kind of how things in this country have been designed and built. It's built for that middle group there, right? So people who aren't, for whatever aspects of that, don't fit that. It's just important to see where you stand and where your family stands in that, and kind of understand that part of your identity as you start this work.
So I would say Donald pretty much went over this, so I think we can skip the cycle of oppression. But I do think it's important to talk about current forms of oppression and blaming, avoidance of contact, denial of differences, and false equivalence. That is things such as equating, you know, that race is, you know, race differences is the same as, and add any other isms. And it's not a battle for who's being the most oppressed, but understanding that the intersectionality of the two go together. Right.
I think Donald pretty much covered this as well. Again, just some slides here about prejudice and racism. And I think he spent a lot of time on that, so we don't necessarily need to dwell more on that here. And I think it's a fundamental, one of the fundamental understandings of this work is to really understand the history of anti-Black racism and anti-Blackness in the country. And that's a unique American phenomenon. It's a white settler phenomenon. So countries that are sort of settler societies, which the United States is. So, and you can see how these things work in tandem. So colorism, white supremacy, and structural racism to marginalize Black people. So just that's an understanding that I think you would want to dive a little bit deeper into, along with color blindness. And so saying things like, I don't see color, and hopefully after what we just kind of went through, you can see how that's oppression, right? And so that's the denial of differences. It's also the denial of the historic impact of race and how some people move through the world and have a very different experience. So if I'm a white person, a privileged white person who says, I don't see color, well, I've just erased Tanya's history and her experiences, right? I don't know, Tanya, if you want to add on to that anymore.
No, I think Donald touched on that a lot in the general session, and so I think folks have a good idea of what the impact of that is.
So if you're going to stop saying things or stop doing things, the first thing I would say as a parent is don't tell other people that your kids don't see race or that you don't see it, that you're raising them to be colorblind. We want you to go in the opposite direction. We want you to value, we want you to teach them to see, kids notice these things, and the research is very clear that from a very young age, kids make decisions based on skin color and race and things like that. From early as 18 months, they're seeing those differences. So it's, number one, it's not true. And number two, it's oppression, right? So you're perpetuating these systems. So leaning into it and understanding and teaching your kids the appropriate language, and that's a piece of anti-bias education, which we'll talk a little bit more about. So one of the books that I would recommend, obviously, we'll give more resources at the end, but we'll talk a little bit about this book called Blind Spots, which is the hidden biases of good people. And one of the topics that they talk about is implicit bias, and that we all have implicit bias, and that we need to and I think this bullet point here, that we can develop the ability to critically observe ourselves. So the first step of that is to really understand where your bias lives. And this is a test. It's an online test that you can take. There's one called, they go through multiple different areas. So there's some on gender and disability and body image and things like that. But the race, we'll talk a little bit about the race one. So the race implicit association test, they've done for years. It's through Harvard, and that there's a consistent automatic white preference among white respondents, and sometimes among other groups as well. So if you've taken the test, they show you different pictures of people and ask you to assign words to it, and so that's called implicit bias, and that's fed by the information that we receive daily. So if you're only reading books by white authors and watching any entertainment, really these days, and surrounded by people who look like you, then your implicit bias most likely is going to increase, right? If you associate smart people with white male academics, then that's a bias that's inside of you. And so the point of this is that diversity matters in all corners of our lives, and that you need to start as a parent. And again, think of your kids as sponges around you, absorbing everything that you see. They're going to develop implicit, they already have it, but they're going to further develop implicit bias if you're not looking strategically at the diversity in all corners of their lives as well, and what you're modeling for them.
And I'd just like to add is that implicit bias and blind spots is something that usually you are not going to notice, right? Otherwise it wouldn't be a blind spot. And so to remember that it's going to be usually an uncomfortable moment where someone points it out to you, right? So it's going to be one of those moments of, fight or flight, or listen and learn. So just to remember that blind spots are blind spots because we don't know they exist.
And that's why I think people who work in diversity and inclusion, so whether it's in a corporate setting or a school setting, those are really difficult jobs, because part of what they're doing is pointing out blind spots, pointing out cultural, institutional, personal, and interpersonal blind spots. And people don't always take that very well, right? And so understanding that if you're working to become an ally or a co-conspirator in this work, is if you are coming from a position of privilege, whether you're a male or you're white or you're able-bodied or heterosexual, that your part of your work too is to dismantle these biases and to point these things out, and not to leave it to the people in your life who are suffering from this bias to point that out all the time. And so I would really encourage you to take this implicit association test, and the link is here. And this presentation slides will be shared, but you can do a search for it and find it quite easily. That's a good starting point as a parent.
So sorry. Go ahead. No, it's you.
Okay. Self-reflection questions. So again, these are things that, again, kind of a roadmap as a starting point for you as a parent. Audit your media consumption. How well read are you? So if you only read authors of a certain, background, right? Diversify that. And again, to kind of play on what Donald said too, really deconstruct the knowledge, the historical knowledge that you have, and question kind of everything. Particularly if you're graduated high school in the 70s, 80s, even 90s, look at the lessons that you were taught, and really start to unlearn those, and really look for a true history, a real history. Again, think about like when you go, who do you have in your life that gives you advice, or who do you go to when you need something? Who are those people? And do you value certain groups' opinions over others? So again, just something to think about. How diverse is your life? And by extension, your child's life, right? Because they're going to be your friends, and their children are going to be your friends with your kids. And so how diverse is that group? Who do you spend time with? Who do you eat with? Who do you go out with? And And how broad is your own worldview from personal experience? And how can you broaden it? And again, tying all that back to your children. So that's just something to think about. And if, maybe take it home with your partner, look that together as a family and sort of say, like, what are we doing? And how can we make this all work together? Which plays into the next part, which we'll go through really briefly. As a parent, if you're parenting with another person, then you've created a family system. And thinking about a family system and doing anti-racist work, they go hand in hand. Again, you're going to change the orientation of that system, right? You're going to take that system that's moving on that moving walkway, and you're going to turn it around and move it in a different direction. And what this says, I like this little image better. And you can see that there was I didn't make this originally, but there was a blind spot, and obviously it said husband, wife, brother, sister. And we know families are a lot more complex than that. There's parent one, parent two, child one, child two. There could be co-parents, there could be grandparents, there could be stepchildren, there could be all sorts of people in a system. And that the system is all interdependent. And so you can see that there's a parental subsystem. So the lead parents are one system, and the siblings are a subsystem, but they all interact with each other, and they're all getting input from the environment around them. And so the point here is just to be aware of that. So if you're really passionate about anti-racism and you're co-parenting with someone else, and that person's not on board or is neutral or thinks you're crazy, then that needs to be addressed in doing anti-racist work. But let's say they are on board and you two of you are doing this together. But what about grandma who lives in the back? Maybe she's got some biased views. And just understand that all of that's focusing in on your children, that they're absorbing all of that within the system. And so it's just attending to that dynamic, and knowing that to make the children, or to help the children become anti-racist, anti-biased humans, it takes all the people in the system. The system needs to be attuned to do that for them. And so just something to think through as you audit yourself and your family, is to think about that family system and how healthy it is in terms of anti-bias education. I think Donald shared the same thing, and the emphasis here is the lifelong journey. And back to that, also the slide that once you're in the growth zone, you're always in the growth zone. And the other way I like to think about this too is that there's often a narrative that comes with people when they say, well, I'm not racist, I'm a good person. And that's something that I think we all need to stop saying. Growing up or living in the United States, consuming media, consuming life, the news, anything here, we're picking up bias and racist messages all the time. And we have to actively fight against those, but we have to realize that those biases live in all of us, and that we're on a continuum, right? And at one end, which most likely we'll never meet, is sort of perfection. And at the other end is a horrible, cross-burning, hood-wearing racist, right? And that we're moving on that continuum, moving towards perfection, but that we're never going to get there, and that the work is continual, and that we have to sort of dive into that. And then you want to set your children up for that understanding too, that this is a lifelong journey to enter on, and that anti-bias education is an excellent framework to do that with. So we're going to pause for a second and take the first round of questions.
All right. So one question is, I've had a neighbor say that our city is segregated because people are just more comfortable to those who are like them culturally and economically. I wasn't sure what to say in response to that. What are your thoughts about this? And on a more practical level, I believe you might have talked about this a little bit, but if our neighborhood and circle of friends are monocultural, how do we broaden our interactions and friendships? How do we seek more diverse relationships, but do it without feeling or looking like we are checking a box?
So I want to talk a little bit about the idea or the belief that people live in segregated neighborhoods because they want to. And there's been a lot of research done and you know, redlining and many other public sanctioned segregation programs put us in different neighborhoods. And so there's a whole history of racialized housing oppression and discrimination that cannot be forgotten or omitted from this conversation. And there is truth also that we do tend to gravitate towards people that are like us. And so that's why we ask questions like, oh, what college did you go to? Or what high school did you go to? Or where are you from? And so we're looking for likeness because we are drawn towards it. But the segregation has a history of omitting certain groups of people from certain neighborhoods, not lending to them. And you know, there's lots of different resources out there that that talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, and I think again, it's looking at the history, and there's some great resources around that. I think the Washington Post did a whole series last summer on sort of the current, looking at the United States through the lens of the long legacy of slavery. And things that you wouldn't think about as tying back to slavery. But one of them is the interstate system and thinking of where freeways got placed. And if you think of Los Angeles, for example, the 10 freeway, which cuts through the city and became a dividing line. On one side, whites, on the other side, not whites. And if you look at Alameda Avenue, which goes from downtown south, on the east side of it, it was white. On the west side of it, it was black. And it was a dividing line. And many cities have those similar. Detroit has 8 Mile. You look at that. So those are very consciously done decisions that were made to sort of segregate people. So the other thing to think about is that systemic racism creates a difference in wealth and difference in income. So not everybody has the choice to live. You know, there's a huge wealth disparity, right? And home ownership is the deciding factor for many people, right? That's how wealth gets passed intergenerationally. So if you were redlined and not able to get a mortgage and only allowed to live in a certain area, well, then your family hasn't acquired wealth, where some families were able to do that, right? And so the history of Los Angeles is that there's a history of redlining throughout the city. So again, it's diving into understanding those topics a little bit better. And again, if you're living in Los Angeles or any large metropolitan area, they're incredibly diverse places, and you can bring diversity into your life in a lot of ways. It requires getting out of your comfort zone and getting out of and sort of fighting against, like, I don't go to that area because it's unsafe. It's unpacking that a little bit. What are you afraid of? What actually is going to happen? Is it unsafe? That's a bad school because it's just a bad school. Well, is it black and brown kids that go to that school? That's why it's not a good school. It's like, it's unpacking these biases that we have and really challenging them.
And I don't want to belabor it, but we can't just leave it to housing and lending decisions. There are other ways in which Black people specifically, and then later other groups of people of color were systematically left out. So Black and Indigenous have always been the beginning barometer for exclusion. And Social Security is a great example of that. When Social Security was developed, it was developed to protect white women because husbands had died in the war and they didn't have a form of income in order to help them. So it was not built for all people, and it excluded people that held certain kinds of jobs. So people that worked in maintenance and people that worked in the fields. And so that totally wiped out a whole group of people, because at that time, African Americans were the maids and things of that sort, and the Latinx were working in the fields. And so what does that wealth gap mean? It means that then white people's parents were able to take care of themselves, right, and put money into the household so that the younger generation could pass the wealth on. whereas people of color had to take care of their current household and their aging parents because their parents didn't get Social Security. So I'm saying that as an example that you cannot pull apart just one part of it. It is the entire system that has been built around to keep entire groups of people down. And I noticed in the Q&A that people are anxious to get to more of the diving into how do we as a parent make it happen. I don't know if we want to move on, but I know that Ted's next area is really practical in terms of the things that you can do with your children to help with the anti-racist curriculum, anti-bias curriculum.
And Joanna, do you want to maybe, is there any other questions?
Yeah, there are. One comment is, I'm asking this in light of what has been taught in this presentation thus far. Is this only for parents who are isolated and enjoy a privileged existence? If not, when will we move on to parents who don't enjoy isolation and privilege? When will instruction happen for us who've never been privileged or had blind spots that may have cost our lives?
So I'm going to say that the majority of this, so first I want to acknowledge that we all have blind spots. And as was debated heavily in Donald's presentation, Dr. Grant's presentation, is that this idea of racism affects everyone, even if you are a Black, Indigenous, or person of color. And so we are all contributors to it in this strange way. And our blind spots don't allow us to necessarily be able to see what those things are. But racism is insidious because it's built in the systems. And so we may not even, so when I used to code switch, when I went to work, I was giving in to racist ideas. When I straightened my hair because it made white people feel more comfortable, I was giving in to racist ideas. And so my belief is that the presentation speaks to all families, because if you I'll use myself as an example. I'm a Black parent. I always come from the Black perspective. And so if I'm only teaching my kids about Black folks, they're already learning about white folks, then who am I leaving out? That's the question that you have to answer. And so although we may be using the terminology Black and white and Indigenous often, it really does apply to all groups of people. But this presentation was set up to be about how to be an anti-biased parent, right? And to raise kids that are anti-biased. And so in some ways I can see how it could leave out groups of people that are further along. That's what I'm hearing is what's resonating with me is that there's this feeling of that this is geared towards starters and it is not advanced. And I would say that in many ways I would agree with you. And I'm just going to apologize for that. I think when we that's why I was trying to move us on. If we can get into how do you look at a book and determine whether or not that book is worthy of being read to your child, that applies for all parents. And so that's my answer to it.
Yeah, and we wanted to, we weren't in this format, we're not really able to sort of know who's in the room. So we tried to cover a little bit for everyone. And so we'll try to dive, do a little bit more advanced stuff for everyone as we move through. And I think just to add to Tanya's point that bias and oppression live everywhere. And, you know, it's bringing out those to the forefront, particularly in light of the fact that our students move through this world and they're picking up messages. And those biases and oppression may not come from the family, but they may come from outside sources. And it's just like being aware of that and thinking that through. I would encourage you to do that and see what media they're consuming, who their friends are, how do they view themselves. And I think that's a good lead into our next topic, which is one of the first, it's the first goal of anti-bias education, which is around identity. And this slide comes from Teaching Tolerance, and they have a program, and it's designed for teachers, but this is it's called Perspectives for a Diverse America. And these are a sampling of some of the goals around what anti-bias education looks like in a school setting. But it really applies also to parenting, right? And so the first one around identity is understanding which groups they are a part of, and that they develop a positive social identity based on their membership in those groups. And then they live in multiple groups, right? That they learn the right language and historical and cultural context for those. They recognize that people have multiple identities and that they create unique and complex individuals. That they have pride, confidence, and healthy self-esteem without denying value or dignity of other people. And they'll recognize the dominant culture and their home culture and other cultures and understand how they all interact together. So it's just a sampling of some of the goals that a school, if your school or your child's school is engaged in anti-bias education, these things should be front and center in the curriculum. So when we start to think about identity, and this is again, this is an identity wheel. There's multiple versions of this out there in the world. But if you look at the center section, those are some of the core identity markers. And you can tie this back to that historically included and historically excluded slide. And you can see, what you'd want is your child to have, and you as a parent, to have open conversations around these, right? Gender expression, where their family is from, whether, depending on their age, their sexual orientation, or their what we call affectional orientation, their mental and physical ability, race, ethnicity. Those are some of the core markers of identity. And then you can broaden out from there too. Income is a big one, religion, political beliefs, family structure, appearance, all of those things play into what makes a person a complex and unique person. And so it's using a tool like this. One of the things we do at the school, some of our teachers will teach the kids these markers, right? And so let's say they're reading a novel in the classroom. The kids will be asked to sort of describe a character, use the features of identity to talk about that character and to understand that those, and it's, in a way, it's sort of normalizing those things, normalizing that sort of talking about these things. That if you think about how many of us were raised, is that a lot of things on this list we weren't allowed to talk about. Those were taboo subjects. And so first thing is just how normal are these subjects in your house? And where is the bias flowing in your house, right? Again, just something to think about there. I know some families, like, we don't talk about money, and it could be, and it's typically families from upper income, they teach their kids not to be showy with their money or not to talk about their money. And again, what messages are we sending if we don't talk about certain things? And what messages are the children learning? Again, intersectionality is a topic you can read a lot more on. Kimberly Crenshaw is the legal scholar who developed the framework for it. But really looking at how societal privilege and oppression is complicated, and that different parts are marginalized or privileged in our society. And if you tie that back again to that included and excluded slide, you can see it gives you a broader sense of looking at how things work, right? Because all of us have privilege in certain areas, and we're all, for the most part, marginalized in some areas of our lives. And some of those marginalizations are less significant than others. But just understanding that intersectionality lives in everyone. Here's a graphic just to sort of talk about that. There's the line through the middle. The top could be privilege, and then the oppression lives on the bottom. And again, it's just sort of taking identity and looking at it a lot more complexity, and understanding that bias and oppression live in these spaces, right? And it could be, there's multiple versions of this, but like, for example, where is it? gender expression, right? So if you're not a cisgendered male or female, well, then you're a gender deviant. And some people would say that that's abnormal, right? And so just understanding that those things exist. Age, body image, overweight, underweight, unattractive, attractive, all of those things are make up a person, right? Just a fun illustration of this. It's a striped triangle. It doesn't fit in with the triangle group or the striped group. Where does she fit? And intersectionality is the belief that oppressions are interlinked and cannot be solved alone, right? So neither group wants her. And again, you could apply this, for example, to there's a lot of talk around feminism and white feminism versus bi POC feminism, and so how does intersectionality play about in those sections? So again, just wanted to sort of move through the slides here have some quick activities that you can do as parents. The first one is names. Where does the name come from? Or who are you named for? Why was this name picked? And again, a bunch of ideas to do there. Really diving into kids have that, again, building that pride of who they are, and know their family stories. A lot of times family stories come out of names, and our names are significant pieces of who we are. But that's a good starting point for parents. Another way is just sharing that identity well with your kids, and who am I? Helps with stereotyping and labeling. Identity circles. You could actually do that with your child, or have depending on the ages, you could have a whole conversation around who they are, and really powerful activity to do with your child. Again, pieces of a puzzle, make a jigsaw puzzle themselves with a self-portrait. They could write about an aspect of their identity. You could all do it as a family, share that information with their children. It's powerful. And most importantly, I think, is storytelling. And again, if you've got elders in your family, or those family stories, and understanding, like Tanynya shared. Tanynya has wonderful, amazing stories about her family, and just sharing that with your children shows them that they're part of something, part of a legacy that's powerful and uplifting for them. And so really understanding that and looking for ways to bring those into your family life of that. And if you do that, you'll know that your children love it. They love to hear about not just when they were young, but when you were young, the grandparents were young, and the lives that they lived. Again, thinking about the communities that you're part of, what does that look like? One thing I'd point you to, if you listen to NPR at all, it's like Friday mornings, there's a little StoryCorps snippet, and there's stories that you can, and there's a participate button, so you can capture those family history stories and upload them to StoryCorps, and they go to they're part of the National or the Library of Congress, so they're archived. But it's a huge way to hear about other people, and to hear about stories, and see how powerful a story can be, particularly around your identity. All right, so now moving to the next topic of diversity. Again, here are the goals again. And again, it's comfort with people who are both similar and different from them, and engage respectively with all of them. Building empathy, respect, understanding, and express curiosity about the history and lived experiences of others. And they have the accurate language to describe people who are different, similar to themselves and different from themselves. So I like to talk about this topic with diversity in books, because again, it's something that you can do with all ages of children. And I think Donald showed this exact same slide, just talking about representation in children's books in terms of characters. And we'll talk a little bit about authorship too. But overwhelmingly, books are written either about animals or white people, right? The characters that show up. So having a critical lens about what your children are reading, or what you're reading to them, and how does a book gain the privilege of being read to your children? and to think of it that way. And it's really doing an audit of your own library, your own exposure to children, so look at the books on the shelves. This is a tool, the Diverse Book Finder. You can enter titles in, and it does a whole sort of analysis of the books. It tells you what they're about, where they fall in terms of identity, and all these different things. But that's a topic that I would really encourage you to audit what they're reading, what they're watching on TV, and making sure that the messages sort of align with what you're wanting them to get. Or if they don't, that you're having conversations about that you're pointing out bias, you're pointing out different things that happen in the book or on the show you're watching or in the movie. You're having conversations about it.
Can I add a little story about the Diverse Book Finder? When I learned about this tool, I was also going through my storage and came across all of the books that I had as a little girl and ran them through it, and was actually just horrified at the fact that the majority of them didn't meet the criteria to be a good book. And that's not to diss my mom and my dad, because they could only buy what was out there, right? So but to run my own library through it, my children's library, my library, and then the library that I provided for my kids, it was just absolutely enlightening, and it was also a little bit sad, and it gave me hope that now we have these kinds of tools so we can make better decisions as parents and adults in young people's lives, and run them through a source. Again, for me, what this does is I realize I also have blind spots. And so even though I look at a book and I'm like, that book is cool, I've found blind spots by running it through a source like this to say, but I didn't think about this part. And so it helped me to be able to then curate a library that has less harm in it, right, is really what we're looking for. We're trying to lessen the harm of the, or eliminate, really we want to eliminate the harm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so the other piece, so it's not just representation in terms of characters, it's also in terms of authorship. So who wrote the book, right? And so there's a movement you may know about called it's a hashtag movement. It started on Twitter. It's called Own Voices. And you know, this author, she made a suggestion that people use the hashtag to recommend books. And that stemmed from her frustration as a bisexual disabled person, and that most emphasis was being placed on diverse books rather than diverse authors. She wanted to highlight authentic voices. And so again, it's sort of looking through, and you can look at a lot of resources on the web about own voices, but it's also important that people are telling, you know, that they are telling those stories from an authentic perspective. And this is a lot harder to find, right? If you look at authorship, children's book authorship or young adult authorship, it's predominantly white. Over 70, 80% of authors are white, and they're telling other people's stories. So I'm not saying their books are bad, or you have to sort of draw a sharp line and say we're not going to read that book because the author's white and it's about, you know, Latinx children. But just know that you should have a diversity in what they're reading, and that you should scan it for authenticity, right? An example, we had some books at the school. They're common, they're mass market books, the Who Was series, right? And if you dive into the Who Was series, they're about all sorts of historical figures, and they've tried to be really to bring in diverse historical figures and whatnot. But the authorship of those is almost entirely white. And so we had a book about who was Harriet Tubman in one of the classrooms, and the teacher, you know, read through it. African-American teacher, she read through it, and there's a page in the book that said that Harriet Tubman at times was she was happy and joyful, and you know, and it just landed the wrong way, obviously. And you know, we removed that book from that collection for that reason. It was just that we wanted to make sure that we're going to talk about Harriet Tubman, that we're also telling historically accurate things around that. And so I think it's just understanding the own voices and really supporting that. The reason, you know, people will say, well, those books just aren't those authors, we need to sell books, it's a business, all of that. Support these authors, support people who are who are struggling to get their books published and who are telling authentic stories. So here's an example. I'll go through this quickly. But this is a book about a Native American girl and written by a Native American author. So again, you could find this on places like Diverse Book Finder. It's called The Jingle Dancer. So I just thought I would sort of unpack a book really quickly for you so you could, again, think about things you could do at home as you're reading to your kids. First thing is picking a diverse book or an own voice book. You know, again, being tribally specific. When talking about Native Americans, thinking what tribe are they from, right? And so the first two, like if you look at the National Congress of American Indians or the Smithsonian Museum of the American Indian, those are great resources for picking books and for resources. But in this story, the character, Jenna, she's from the Muscogee Nation, which if you're from Georgia or live in Georgia, that's where the Muscogee people originated. But now they're in Oklahoma, and you can talk about why they're in Oklahoma today. They were forcibly removed from their land and removed there. And again, understanding whose land do you live on? Who are the Native people around you? Learn the geography together. Right, so using that book as a springboard. So sparking their curiosity around, okay, so this is set in Georgia, where's Georgia? Okay, we don't live in Georgia, we live over here, but who lived here? And you can look for resources like this, you know, that you can put up on the wall in your house. So it's a Native American nations. Where did they come from with their traditional names and locations? So a lot of the names that tribes have are not even the names that's not even their real name, right? So if you think of like the Gabrielino Indians here in Southern California, that was named after the mission, right? And the missionaries that came in here. So it's understanding those nuances as well. And you can see kind of where the concentrations of the different tribes were and the diversity and it's just fascinating to look at something like this with your kids and to really learn that geography as a piece of this. But again, even as you're talking about a book like this, you know, you could say something like, it's, you know, before the Europeans arrived, they lived in Georgia. But again, that's even a soft way of saying it. Maybe you say something like, before the Europeans invaded instead of arrived. Because it was an invasion. It wasn't a welcome necessarily arrival. And again, this book is set in the present day. Often when we think about Native Americans, particularly in schools, they're talked about as these people who lived long ago and they wore these funny clothes and they're gone, right? But this is that's very much not true. Native Americans are all around us and they're people of the present day, just like we are. So helping your kids understand that. And then the other thing is just to think about, when do we talk about Native writers? So if you want to think of a bias that happens in schools all the time, Native Americans are typically taught in the fall because it comes up on things like Columbus Day and Thanksgiving, right? And so that's when we think about it. But why does it have to be? This is a key facet of American history, and should be taught all the time, just like other groups should be taught all the time. And you can learn again some ideas about learning the complexity and the uniqueness of each of these different tribes and things like that. So again, an activity that you could do there. And again, just a little bit on Thanksgiving. Again, if you want to start to unpack bias and structures in your house for all ages, is really just having a critical lens on Thanksgiving. If you think about the history, it's a politically created holiday and it's a myth. And that we really encourage you to tell your children the truth in a developmentally appropriate way. So we're not going to necessarily tell you to teach your 3-year-old about genocide, but we just also would recommend that you don't perpetuate these stereotypes, this misinformation. And again, you think of that story, it didn't start with, the sort of sanitized Hallmark version with a nice big table and the cornucopia and all of that. The Wampanoag were celebrating a harvest feast for thousands of years. And when the settlers arrived, one of the first things they did was steal food from them, right? So that's, in reality, the first Thanksgiving. Anyway, so I think it's like in your house, again, have a critical eye on that holiday. Well, how do you celebrate that holiday? Why do you celebrate that holiday? what is it, if you were going to repurpose it, how would you repurpose it, right? But just again, thinking about that, that's become such a part of our modern consumer holiday, right? That the real story is lost behind that. But it's a chance to be an ally and advocate and work for justice, is to think about that story critically. All right, I think we can pause there. And we're dumping a lot of information on you again, and I think Tanynya and I would acknowledge that we would probably spend a couple days on this if we were in person or we were doing this with more time. So just know that we know it's a lot of information to throw at you. But Johanna, do you have more questions?
Yes, and thank you so much for all the great information. A question we have is, if you were to change anti-racism into a positive framed word, what word would it be?
Well, we can unpack that question a lot, but I would say if you were to answer the question, I would say, working for justice, working for equity, working for inclusion, I think would be other ways of saying the same thing. But I think it's important to say what we're working against and to be okay with that, right? And it's not, you're dismantling a system that's oppressing people, right? And we don't have to necessarily be too worried about being too strong in our language, because these systems have real impacts on people that aren't good. And so I'm okay with saying anti. It's a good thing to be, in my opinion, it's a good thing to be anti. I don't know, Tanynya, what do you think?
Yeah, I would say that if you were to ask this question to lots of different folks, you're going to get lots of different answers. And I'm in agreement with Ted that we move away so much from the truth of what we're fighting against, and we call it many other things. Like my thing is, why are we calling racist comments microaggressions? Why do we say, why have we changed the language from "you said a racist comment" to you said a microaggression? That's a microaggression, right? It's renaming it for comfort. And so for me, I'm okay with it not feeling good. That's just kind of the place that I come from. And I would say, ask this question often from lots of different people to help to come up with a way of talking about it that's comfortable for you. And it is weird to say, I still pause sometimes, depending on the group I'm talking to say anti-racist. And I oftentimes will choose anti-biased in order to make other people comfortable, right? Because racist is a very charged word. But I love that question.
We have another question. At your school, do you celebrate Thanksgiving, and how do you do it?
We don't actually. We don't celebrate it. In the fall, we do a series of units, and we use materials from Rethinking Schools, which is a great organization if you're not familiar with. They publish a tremendous amount of resources for teachers around social justice and equity and inclusion. And there's one that we use on Rethinking Columbus, and there's Rethinking Thanksgiving, included in that is Thanksgiving. There's a bunch of ways to look at it critically. But really, we look a lot at Columbus and Columbus Day and thinking about the historical implications of that. And that came out of a debate internally that, the school used to take Columbus Day off, and then we stopped doing that, and then, whole process about doing that. But we encourage we don't have those sort of holiday celebrations at all.
We also have someone who's raised their hand. Araceli, I'm going to just unmute you, I guess. Are you there, Araceli? Are you wanting to chat? Okay. Okay. Let's see. Another question is, do you celebrate holidays at your school? What other ways do you incorporate multiculturalism and social justice?
Well, I can start, and then Tanynya, you can jump in. But I think the first way to think about it is that it's not an add-on. And I think a lot of schools will say, well, we're going to teach math, we're going to teach science, and we have an initiative this year for diversity and inclusion. We're going to be all about diversity and inclusion, which then doesn't work, right? It compartmentalizes the work. And so we look at the work, equity inclusion work, as the umbrella that we feed everything through, right? Because it is everything. So it's the umbrella that sort of it goes into all the subjects that we're talking about. And really teaching through our social studies scope and sequence is multiple perspectives. So when you're teaching historical, for example, when you're teaching historical subject, whose voices are included, whose are not, which perspectives are missing, how do we bring in those perspectives? So we're talking about the American Revolution. Well, the standard story is, the English came over, they colonized and built the country, and so on. But there's a lot of different people who are involved in that story. And so really attending to each of those groups and really asking the kids to think critically about the lessons that they're getting. It all comes under the lesson of developing critical thinkers, and really students who can question and participate and have a viewpoint and defend their viewpoint. And you have to do that by exposing them to lots of different ideas. In terms of holidays, we don't celebrate holidays for lots of reasons. But again, you could spend if you're going to go down. I think sometimes schools do that, and they wind up celebrating. It's a holiday a week, right? And so I think what we'd rather do is really equip kids with a critical eye on what's going on in the world around them, and spend class time on building those critical thinking skills that are inclusive. And a lot of times holidays, celebrating the traditional holidays can be exclusive too, right? So families may have religious reasons they don't celebrate Christmas or celebrate birthdays or things like that. So it's just sort of attending to the diversity in your community as well.
And I'm going to add that I'm happy to say that our school now hires for it. In other words, in our hiring process, we hire teachers that have an understanding of anti-bias, anti-racist curriculum, that are not beginners in JEDI work, right? Justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion work. We're looking for faculty that can pick up the ball and move with us, because we're not at the beginning stage anymore. And so we're looking for faculty for that. We do continuing education. We have affinity groups. We listen. So I'm going to say, we're deep in this work, and we make mistakes all the time. And I often, when I used to counsel families prior to being in this position, I would often tell them, and I'm going to give you it in this next portion. There are lots of questions you can ask of a school to find out how deep they are in their process of creating an anti-bias, anti-racist school, and in a school that it has a strong sense of belonging, right, and less of a sense of othering. And let's be honest, we are in an independent school. I'm not going to make the assumption that everybody here is, but an independent school wasn't built for us. And for us, I mean Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And so we're fighting against the stream in terms of trying to create a community that includes us. And so, we're really aware of this. And so it is forever something that we're going to continually have to work on, because we do have those blind spots. And I'm just looking at the time. We have 2 more sections. I don't know if we have one more question we want to take.
Okay, there's one more here that was asked, I guess twice. Much of this presentation seems to be centered upon parents who are beginning on the journey of anti-bias, anti-racism. Will the presentation shift into a higher gear for parents who have been on this journey for 15 plus years, who need resources and support?
Sure. We can, yeah, I think if there's things that come out in terms of questions, if there's particular things you'd want to know, let us know that. And again, I think a lot of these topics are, you know, you could take in many different directions, and we'll be providing more resources and ideas at the end as well.
Thank you so much.
All right.
So next is justice. And this is where all of the personal work and the interpersonal work starts turning into children being able to actually acknowledge, see, analyze, recognize power, privilege, stereotypes, and begin to identify the impact of that. And so we can move to the next slide. So I think of what the cycle looks like, and so justice is interrupting, right? And so it's interrupting white advantage, which includes poor whites and wealthy whites. Oftentimes, poor whites like to pivot out of it because of the word privilege. So I'm going to say white advantage, because statistically, whites fare better in any statistical data than other groups of people. So white advantage, interrupting microaggressions, cultural appropriation, and many of these we covered. And it also interrupts the freezing. And oftentimes we freeze. And I did see in the questions, how do I respond when someone has a blind spot? How do I move forward in that? And I will give some ideas on how to do that in a moment. And noticing oppressive language. Ted mentioned it earlier in terms of talking about book choice and particularly Indigenous and Native American folks. The way we talk about groups of people impacts the way in which we feel about them, right? So justice is bringing some of that to groups of people. And then next is action, right? And so moving along, there's more empathy, right? It's sunk in a bit, right? And there's more, and in action, it means that kids then feel empowered, be they Black, Indigenous, or people, or children of color, or if they are white students, right? That they are starting to feel as though they can say something, they should say something, they should do something. And so I really like this quote by Malcolm, we need more light about each other. Light creates understanding, it creates love, love creates patience, and patience creates unity. And so moving through, I went through interrupt, and then next would be disrupt. Right, so interrupt is very personal. It's in the home, and it's the work that you do. Disrupt is when you move further along in the continuum, and it becomes the interpersonal becomes bigger spaces. So it might be your workspace. It may be your friend space. It moves out of the comfort of your own home and into the institutional spaces. And in that. You're working to create more proximity with other groups of people. You become a group affinity, and a member of affinity group, and you're jumping off that cycle of oppression, and you're beginning to see systems of change and identifying them and noticing this is something we need to change in our institution. For instance, hiring practices. It's like, well, oftentimes institutions will say, well, we just, Black people just aren't interested in working at our institution. Well, is that true, or is it everything that goes into recruitment in which tells Black people that this is not an institution for them. So identifying that and then being ready to bring that forward. And then deconstruct is, you know, we have to tear it all down. If we try to reconstruct on top of a broken system, then we are going to resort back to the former system. And so deconstructing means actually making the change. And so that means joining boards and creating accountability in institutions and culturally. And so some of that deconstruct is what Ted mentioned earlier. Part of deconstructing is having different choices in friendships and conversations that you're going to have with people. So that's the personal part of it, right? And doing that shows your children that some people are friends and some people are not. And if people do not align with you, that they interrupt your space. And then to reconstruct, of course, is all of the above. And putting it all back together in a very different way, reimagining institutions and being inclusive and creating a sense of belonging. So, so what does that personal change look like? We talked a little bit about acknowledgement, right? We have to acknowledge that we all have blind spots. Some of us have more blind spots than others. We all have things to learn. And so figuring out what are those things that I need to learn and making it a priority. And you can learn a lot from children's books. So if you have a preschooler, a kindergartner, an elementary schooler, you can learn a lot just from reading well-chosen books and diving into them and answering questions. And for your children, you want to break those cycles of monoculturalism. And you want to create spaces where you're with people that don't think like you, that don't look like you. And our advice is that you allow your child's curiosity to lead. Now, this is a privilege for white families. I'm just going to put it out there, right? Is that so Black children, specifically, I'm going to speak from my own experience, we don't have the luxury of waiting for a child to ask a question. We oftentimes have to do that teaching in order to prevent any harm being done to our children. So I'm just going to name that allowing your child's curiosity to lead is part of privilege. And in that, answering the questions that are asked, right? And to not pivot from them. Definitely, you don't want to shush your child when they ask a question that's difficult. And because you become uncomfortable is not a good enough reason to figure out how to answer that question. And join and contribute. I saw some of the questions about, well, how do I develop friendships without feeling like I'm checking a box? It needs to be authentic to you. And I'm going to say that we all interact with groups of people that don't look like us and don't have the same belief systems as we do. And it can begin with a hello and a conversation, and then and then nurture that relationship. Being a critical contributor means that you're actually doing something. You've joined an action group. You've put your money towards a group, and you're really making it a priority. It's a moral priority for you and your family and for your children. And so that could also be your choice of school. And we've mentioned this before, I'm just going to say it again, teaching what happened, everybody existed before they were enslaved or that they were colonized. And so teaching the beauty of that history before teaching the colonization of this group, the oppression of that group. And to be sure that included in that, with the oppression and the colonization, that you teach the resistance of the group of people that you are speaking about with your children. So this, James Baldwin has so many great quotes out there that we could do a whole slideshow with just all his words. But there's a continuum of growth, yet only two sides of a coin. you are not, you are or you're not. And so this might be striking for some people. And so that continuum of growth means that you want to be in the growth mindset in order to be on the side of the coin that is truly anti-racist, anti-biased. And so there is no true in between. There is only the continuum of growth. And in that, you know, you have to continually be working at being an anti-racist in order to stay on the side of that coin. So I promised that I would give you some ways in which you can kind of, you know, ask your school and find out where your school is in terms of an anti-bias curriculum or a school of belonging. So these are some of those questions. Does the school have an anti-bias scope and sequence? What is the process for resolving biracial bias or racial incidents? Ask about how the school hires, and is it something that they're looking for? Are faculty and staff accountable? In other words, if I don't do this work, is it going to affect my paycheck? Is it going to affect my performance review? I can say that at my school it does. Our teachers are held accountable for their teaching of an anti-bias curriculum with multiple perspectives, just like they are about how they teach their math program. And then, you know, storytelling is, again, a very powerful way. So I'm an admissions director, so I can tell a story. I can tell you what we do, what we don't do, and all of that. But ask someone to tell a story about an incident and how it was resolved. That will really give you the information you're looking for, right? It's the proven part of the written memorandum that this is who we are. We all have mission statements. And I'm pretty sure you've looked at people's mission statements and you know good and well that they don't really believe in that mission statement based on your interactions with them and the way you've been treated personally, or that other people have been, or their choices in various things. So storytelling is one way to get at the root of whether or not a school is really doing this work. And then asking the tougher question, well, tell me about an incident that wasn't resolved to your satisfaction, and what's different now than when that was not satisfied, when it wasn't taken care of. Gender neutral bathrooms is a real simple way to know where a school is in terms of their inclusion, their ideas of inclusion. And then, you know, again, statistics can be really tricky. People love to use percentages, right? We use percentages on our website. It gives a certain story, but the truth is, percentages it can skew the actual number depending on how small the core number is. And so really you should be asking for numbers. If you're interested in how many Black teachers there are, then ask how many Black teachers, not a percentage, and that gives you a good idea. Ask for what the strategic goals are surrounding anti-bias curriculum and justice work. And ask the question, how do you foster a culture of belonging, and what supports are there for the work that you're doing? And so that's just a few of the questions in which you can ask, because we believe that we are in partnership with our parents, and so we should walk the walk. And when I get these kind of questions during the admissions process, I already know, I'm like, I want this family here, because they get it, right? They're asking the questions that matter, because they're gonna understand us, and they're not at that beginning stage, right? So they understand the importance of the work, and they have some idea what depth looks like and feels like.
And Tanynya, I saw some questions in the conversation in the chat and in the questions as well around hiring. And how do you hire, how do you answer? I saw there's a chat about, well, we just can't find qualified Black candidates. They don't apply or whatnot.
Can I tell my story?
Yes, go for it.
So Ted hired me because I have dual professions, right? One profession is in admissions and marketing and enrollment, and then the other is that that I have done workshops and consulting in multiculturalism, justice, equity, and diversity work. So he hired me specifically to help to move forward the work that they had already done before I was there. And that first year, we really struggled because we wanted to hire more students, more faculty of color. And by the end of it was my first year, and so by the end of that year, I went to Ted and I told him, and this is why I love working at this school. I said, Ted, we have to change our hiring practice. And he was like, yeah, I know. And so we talked through it. And here's what we did. We say specifically that we want people of color. We want teachers of color. So we put that in our advertisement for positions. Another thing that we like to do when we are in education is we hold education in super high regard. And so one of the first things we do is we look at where someone graduated from. And so my challenge was, do we want to hire a university or do we want to hire good teachers? And of course, the answer is we want to hire good teachers. I said, then where they graduated from should not matter. What matters is their demonstrated ability to be a good teacher. And so what we did was we changed our process in order to find good teachers. Not only good teachers, but teachers that love kids. Believe it or not, there are teachers that don't love kids. And so we searched for ways in which we can ask questions and get demonstrations of their commitment to students and to learning and to a growth mindset and to an anti-bias, anti-racist curriculum. And so in doing that, that next year, we hired 3 Black teachers and one Latinx teacher. Boom, it changed. In the next 2 years, we increased it by 4 African-American teachers and 1 Latinx teacher. Just by changing the way in which we advertised for it. And I always get the pushback, well, can we really do that? Yeah, you can. You can say that we are encouraging people of color to apply. Because if you read the book, Whistling Vivaldi, it talks about a critical mass. And so oftentimes we will look at a website and figure out whether or not we are welcomed in that environment. And oftentimes the pictures tell us something. And so we now have a critical mass because in the process, Ted and I promised we will support you. That was another thing. We were like, we know this is a privileged environment. And Patty, our assistant head of school, and we all sat in that room and we made a promise to that teacher of color that we were going to support them. And so transparency is huge. You got to be transparent in your process and in what you're looking for and what you want. We also hired white teachers during that time as well. So nobody said, this isn't for me. We hired white teachers and we hired Black teachers and Latinx teachers.
Just one final point. Again, if you're working in an organization that's saying something like, well, we just can't find well-qualified employees of color or whatever, that you challenge that and you say, because the person who's screening, one way to think about it is the person who's screening the resumes that come in, that's the first gatekeeper right there. So you want to look at that process and challenge that process. And could there be more than one eye on the resumes coming in? So that's one tweak we made to our process. We said, well, let's have a lot of people look at the paper screen phase. Let's have a lot of different eyes on that. And let's come up with an objective way of rating candidates that we're going to move forward or not move forward. So we did that. So that got more people into the pool. And again, it's kind of a lazy answer, right? To say, well, they're just not walking up and knocking on the door. Well, go out and look for them. Try harder. They're out there. And it starts with that belief. And then it's probably also auditing a little bit, like, what's your organization's reputation in the community? Have you had employees of color have bad experiences there? you know, is there history that needs to be sort of, you know, brought to light and addressed? So those are sort of things that I would also add to that question.
Ted and Tanynya, I wanted to ask a question on behalf of someone who's, I know she's asked several times, but regarding the term anti-racist, would you say it's more appropriate to label curriculum improvements at schools as anti-racist curriculum or diversity, equity, and inclusion curriculum? What would you say is the difference between those terms?
I think we're going to, in a later slide here, we're going to kind of dive into the different terms. So maybe we could, do you want to address that now or then, Tanya?
I'm thinking about what Donald said in the general session. I don't want to pivot from it. And I'm going to say that every community is different. It took Ted and then me, because I came later, 10 years to get to the point where we felt comfortable saying anti-racist curriculum. And so every institution is somewhere different on the continuum. It took us that long to get to the point. You know, we started off saying multiple perspectives, multicultural curriculum, anti-bias, anti-racist curriculum. So that's been our growth. I don't think that necessarily calling it a diversity, equity, and inclusion curriculum is quite right, because it doesn't flow into curriculum. And when you say this is our diversity curriculum, it lands on people in this weird way. We have to be very conscious of the way in which our communities interpret words. And so I'm going to say that in the end, your institution has to determine whether or not that's going to work. And I'm going to say, and don't be afraid to change, right? So you start in one place and be ready to move it on to a different term, right? As you begin to solidify and grow and deepen in the curriculum or the initiatives. And I hope that answered it.
Maybe this slide will help too.
Yeah, and so diversity, you know, diversity asks who's in the room. And equity is a deeper question in that who's trying to get in the room but can't, and whose presence in the room is a current threat, is constantly a threat, right? And inclusion is asking the question, has everyone's ideas been heard? And justice is whose ideas have not been taken seriously, and who's in the majority and who's not, right? And you notice we put a lot of questions out there, because I saw some of the questions in the Q&A is, how do I respond when somebody has a blind spot? And a great way is to ask a question such as this. And so if someone says, you know, we're going to have the picnic at, you know, we're going to have all of the parent meetings at noon on Wednesdays. And you're sitting there thinking, but that excludes all working parents. And then you can frame it in the form of a question, right? And it falls in one of these boxes. And so the question can be along the lines of, will a noon meeting accommodate all families' schedules? And then it gets people to think and to notice their own blind spot. Their blind spot is, well, you know, we're in an independent school, and, you know, most of the mothers don't work, or they have flexible schedules. They can make it at noon, right? But asking the question gets people to do some self-reflection. And then that also keeps you from throwing out accusations. That is, if you have the bandwidth to frame that question. So oftentimes Black, Indigenous, and people of color are so fatigued from being the people in the room, and white people that are doing this work, from always being the people, as Ted said, who's pointing it out. And so Audre Lorde says, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us to temporarily beat him at his own game, but they will never allow us to bring genuine change. And I think I talked a little bit about that. That's the difference between, we have to deconstruct the system before we can then rebuild and reconstruct the system. And so I want to talk just really briefly about these terms. We've used them. There's new terminology all the time, and ally was the most popular word for those of us that are sitting in a majority in any part of our life. And it just doesn't fare very well anymore, because the, right now, folks are asking for action. And so that's where a co-conspirator or an accomplice is. And I can just sum those two up by saying that that means that you put your moral compass is in it. You've put your body in the fight. You've put your resources in the fight, which includes money and time. And you are in there doing the work. And so folks are looking for change, and change means that there is an action and there are steps to moving towards transforming homes, your personal home, your relationships, and the institutions that you are a part of.
Yeah, and I would say, like, if you're not part of a marginalized group that you consider yourself to be an ally or co-conspirator or accomplice for, that don't give yourself that name. That name should be earned and given to you, right? So I think that's just a subtle, don't lead with "I'm an ally," like lead with actions, lead with doing the work, right? And let people bestow that on you with based on something that you're doing. I think that these can get, people can self-identify these, and I think that is counter effective.
And I am no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I'm changing the things I cannot accept. And for me, this is all about action, right? You don't accept, but you're willing to change.
Right. We have time for some questions here, and then a few final thoughts, and then we'll be done.
Yeah, we have resources towards the end.
I think a lot of the questions kind of toward right now have to do with sort of the publishers of anti-bias curriculum and different resources. At least that's what I'm seeing here in the Q&A.
Well, then let's go ahead and give them more resources, Ted, because that's
Okay.
that's what's left. So this, I'll just go over it really quick. This is a great way, as we're moving through change and we're learning about a new group of people or a new idea. And I love it because it's stop, start, continue, and change. And so what are the behaviors that I'm going to stop doing? And what are the actions that I'm going to take, that I'm going to start? And what am I doing that's right and I'm going to continue doing? And then what am I going to change? Like, what behaviors are kind of okay, but I need to make some small adjustments to. And so this is a great way to think about where you're at with your learning, and coming up with a plan to actually grow and move forward.
So again, we talked a little bit about learning history and learning history from alternative sources. So this is one great book that also has a youth version, right? So this is geared towards adults, obviously, but there's a youth version of this that can be used, 4th, 5th grade and up. But it's written by a Native American scholar, and sort of goes through the history of that. And it's a really transformative book. It's a heavy book to read if you don't know the history, but it's very transformative in terms of understanding kind of what I call the 3 pillars of our history, which is settler colonialism, founding a state based on white supremacy, slavery, and genocide. So we think of those 3 pillars that live on today, right? So the remnants of those are still alive with us, but really reframing US history in that context. Lots of examples to go forward. So I would highly recommend that, and again, the companion book for young readers. Similarly, you're probably aware of this one, Howard Zinn, People's History of the United States, again, has a companion book for young people's history of the United States. So it's sort of, not the horror stories as much as in this one. And then I would look at the Education Project, which is a nonprofit that you can look up online as well, with tons of resources. And I think this is really important. And back to what I said at the beginning, that history is important. If you don't know history, it's as if you were born yesterday. And if you were born yesterday, anybody up there in a position of power can tell you anything. And I think you could point to lots of things in our current history, our current political climate, that illustrate this, right? And if you just want to think for a moment about the statues coming down, so statues of Confederate heroes coming down, right? If you don't really understand what the Confederacy was, what it was trying to do, and when those statues were put up and why they were put up, then you could say, well, they're erasing history. I don't believe in erasing history, part of history. Well, I think if you understood the history, you would maybe have a more nuanced opinion on that subject. So I think that's just one example of that. That putting those statues up was part of, erasing a history of erasing, of keeping a certain group of people down and scared. Some more resources. Tanynya can go through the tons of books.
So there are tons of books. I do know that somebody asked what's the full title of it's Whistling Vivaldi, and the title, the author has I can't remember who the author is, but it's Whistling Vivaldi, and it's got a bunch of colorful dots on the front of it. It's a great book. Racism Without Racists, Blind Spot we talked about. So you want to talk about race is this great book where it's very conversational. Some of you were asking, how do we address this? This is a great book to read in order to be able to really have some language. Nurture Shock, chapter 3 is really great. And even as a Black parent, reading that just really illuminated, oh, now I get why folks don't talk about it. And it helped me to be able to develop ways to be in conversation with white parents who wanted to learn. A kid's book about racism is a great book. Raising White Kids is another one of those books. It is written by a white author, and she talks about her journey with her child, about how and her struggles and what she learned along the way in terms of raising an anti-racist, anti-bias kid. And then we put some of the websites up here: Common Sense Media, Teaching Tolerance. Embrace Race is a great place to go for parents. It's geared towards parents, and they have a webinar once a month. They've been doing them more often since the pandemic, and they all live on the website, so you can always go back and find it. And then The Conscious Kid.
And that's the end. And so that's our contact information. We're happy to, shoot us an email if you've got more questions or thoughts for us. We're happy to answer any of those. And I think the last thing I would say for my final thought would be for many of us, we don't have, particularly white people, we don't have a lot of experience. We're not raised or taught to see ourselves as having a race or talking about race. For many of us, that was a taboo growing up. We were shushed when we asked questions about that. And so there's a lot of fear of doing this wrong, of doing this work wrong, of making a mistake, of saying the wrong thing or offending someone. And I would just sort of say that, again, if you ever watched the Game of Thrones, you remember Arya Stark, when she was learning the sword, that her teacher said that the fear cuts deeper than swords. And so get over the fear, work through the fear, and have these conversations, and that you can do it. And it's empowering, and the more you do it, the easier it gets. And so dive into the work. It's not going to change unless you address it head on.
And my final thoughts is just keep interrupting, disrupting, deconstructing, and reconstructing. and finding spaces in order for you to be restorative and take care of self, and find spaces where people are believe in the same work that you do. And I'm available. That's my email address. I respond to all my emails. So if you still have questions, you want to continue a conversation on some part of this, I'm always available. This is my passion and my love, to talk about this, share, and to learn from you. I saw the questions and I saw the comments. A lot of you guys have great ways of thinking about it, and I'm interested in learning from you as well. So let's be in conversation.